Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Connectivity Issues, Rural Broadband Development. Today's webinar is the first webinar in NCSL's Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's 2016 Spring Webinar Series. As part of this series, the committee will host a new webinar every other Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m., meaning our next webinar will be on April 28th and will focus on multi-sector private partnerships. And for a complete schedule and registration details, please visit our website, www.ncsl.org. My name is Ben Hush, Committee Director for NCSL's NRI Committee, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website. We will send out a notice shortly with a link to these resources. Additionally, you can download the slides being used today by clicking on the library icon. It's the blue and yellow icon in the upper right portion of your screen next to the microphone. And of course, please feel free to submit a question at any time by typing it into the chat box on the left. We will hold a question and answer session after both of our speakers finish presenting. But back to why we are here today. Over the next 45 minutes or so, our speakers will discuss some of the causes and possible solutions to the problem of how, in an age of ever-increasing internet connectivity around the globe, there unfortunately remain rural areas in the United States with little access to these high-speed communications. Here today to help us dive into the specifics of this issue, as well as what can be done to address this difference, we have two excellent speakers. Our first speaker, Charles Davidson, is the director of the New York Law School Advanced Communications Law and Policy Institute. ACLP has published a number of papers on an array of broadband issues with a particular emphasis on promoting broadband optimization and utilization. Prior to joining ACLP, Chuck served as a state regulatory utility commissioner as well as the executive director of Florida's Information Technology Task Force. Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and so thank you for inviting me. This is an incredibly important topic, and as you know, in your experience, sort of every single day working with legislators from across the country, the topic is broadband, broadband, broadband. And in a lot of places in the country, the task of bringing more broadband to market and seeing robust adoption and utilization of that seems not too complicated. In a lot of urban and suburban areas, you see a lot of broadband, a lot of choices, a lot of adoption. Things seem to be going pretty well. In a lot of rural areas, things are certainly going much better as well, but there are just a lot of challenges, as your committee is very well aware. So thank you again. It's a great topic. Turning right to the presentation. So one of the first things that we try and do in all of our presentations on whatever topic is start with data where we can. So when we're talking about broadband connectivity, really the first, and it seems to be a very basic question, but it's not that easy to answer, is what is broadband? If you ask 100 folks out in the field, what is broadband, you might get 100 answers. So with regard to this discussion, in terms of trying to put metrics around the notion of broadband, we thought talking about speed is a useful metric. So the current benchmark from the Federal Communication Commission on what constitutes broadband is, according to the FCC, 25 megabits per second down, 3 megabits per second up. And when you, and this is a relatively recent metric, but when you apply this measure, you get somewhat of an artificial skewing of the real picture of broadband availability in the U.S. So as noted on the slide, the benchmark is somewhat subjective. It was raised just last year from 4 megabits per second down to 25 megabits per second down. And that's great to have aspirations of more speed, more capacity, et cetera. In this discussion, it's important to know that many states have different definitions of broadband, and even the FCC considers 10 megabits per second down broadband for the purposes of Universal Service Fund allocations. So it's the notion of what we're talking about here is complicated by the fact that there's not a whole lot of agreement on speed. We would caution, from the ACLP that broadband speed is ultimately an input. There's no end-all, be-all magical speed. You hear a lot about gigs. You hear a lot about, you need 25 megabits per second. Ultimately, the question is, can a connection do what a user needs it to do? If the answer to that is yes, that's a good thing. If the answer to that is no, then where do we go from there? Turning to the next slide, when you look at this speed metric and look at broadband connectivity across the country, currently about 10% of the population in this country, about 34 million Americans, don't have access to fixed broadband connections that meet the FCC's new benchmark of 25 megabits per second, down 3 megabits per second up. The vast majority of these individuals live in rural areas, and this represents about 39% of the rural population. When you look at tribal land, these numbers are even more extreme, where about 68% of the population is unserved. When you adjust for speed, however, and just come in with lower speeds, broadband of all kinds, wired, wireless, and satellite is more widely available. There are still unserved areas, but you've got more widely available broadband when you account for a lower speed. So the number of rural Americans unserved by fixed broadband decreases to 14.8 million when you're looking at 10 megabits per second down, and to 11.5 million when you're looking at 4 megabits per second down. So that's a substantial decrease that occurs just when you're adjusting for speed. And then if you include mobile and satellite, the numbers drop even more steeply. So turning to the next slide, really the primary impediment when we're talking about rural broadband deployment that we found in our research is that many rural areas are simply uneconomic to serve in the absence of subsidies. In other words, without some additional support, internet service providers will not be able to recoup their investments in building out the infrastructure. So that's the primary impediment we found. Related impediments that sort of give rise to the primary impediment or complement it, not in a positive way, is that you've got low population density, you've got geographical and topographical challenges, you've got a number of regulatory barriers such as difficulty in accessing federal lands to build out infrastructure, and then you've got lower than average adoption rates, so that even when broadband is available, it just seems to be adopted at a lower rate in rural areas than in urban areas. Turning to the next slide, and looking at efforts to address this, and I'm so happy that Keith is here on this panel, because he really is an expert on so many of these federal policy and funding issues. One item that I wanted to just touch on briefly here is the FCC's Connect America Fund. And through the Federal Universal Service Fund, there was a recent expansion to include broadband as a supported service. And this means that qualifying internet service providers can receive federal dollars to deploy broadband in high-cost areas. It's worth noting that USF funds are still being used to support basic telephone service, but there's a long-term plan to transition to supporting only broadband. When we look at how the money is spent, in 2015, total high-cost funding that was available was $4.5 billion. Only $1.2 billion of that 4.5 was allocated to broadband. The other $3.3 billion was allocated to rural carriers for more basic telephone service. And we all, as many folks know, we all pay fees on our bills, telephone bills, wireless bills. If we've got, interconnected VoIP, we're paying fees that go into the Universal Service Fund. But that's really sort of a big discrepancy that hopefully will change over time. You know, we're talking in this country, broadband, 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 and how do we bring broadband to rural America? To have $3.3 billion spent on sort of the more basic telephone service and $1.2 billion spent on broadband, you know, there's a shift that somehow needs to occur. And on the other topics, Department of Commerce and RUS funding and additional federal programs, I know Keith has a great presentation on that, so I just noted that there are other sources out there, and I'll skip that and move to the next slide. In terms of policy efforts to try and address the broadband gap in rural America, there are a number of initiatives at the Federal Communications Commission focused on this, and a number of initiatives within the administration. So at the FCC, there are three major buckets of initiatives. The first is focus on universal service reform, which, you know, related to the prior point, there are a number of efforts to continue enhancing Universal Service Fund and transitioning the fund to support just broadband. There are efforts to use funds to support more mobile broadband deployment and to attract a broader range of internet service providers. There are also a number of spectrum initiatives going on at the FCC to try and free up as much spectrum as possible, recoup spectrum from other sources where it's not being used as much, and auction that back off to market. And in a third bucket, a little bit more focused on regulatory reform, is a number of dockets focused on managing what's called the IP transition from the plain old telephone service network to an all IP network, and reforming the legacy regulatory framework there. This is a really, really tough set of issues to get through at the federal level, because within this very complicated legacy regulatory framework that has evolved over years, there are lots of winners and lots of losers, and the folks who are winning, certainly don't want to give up, rules and regulations that support what they're doing. So it's a very sort of complicated process, and as folks know, these FCC dockets involve tens of thousands of pages of filings, complicated legal arguments, and it's just really tough to, reach agreement. At the administration level, we see NTIA working a lot with the FCC to try and free up additional spectrum, and we see the Broadband Opportunity Council, BBOC, which is a collaboration, so to speak, of agencies from across federal government working on trying to remove barriers to broadband and promote more infrastructure. At the state level, there are a number of state broadband programs, and we see more and more of them launching grant programs to incentivize internet service providers to deploy unserved areas. So I'll just quickly go through New York as a case study. The new New York broadband program, which I think is a great program that Governor Cuomo has spearheaded, is funded with $500 million to bring fixed broadband to remaining unserved parts of the state. And the model is a public-private partnership model that seeks private internet service providers who are willing to match grants on a one-on-one basis. The upside is that there's this great commitment of funds that is intended to plug most of the remaining gaps in unserved New York. Downside, in our opinion, is that this focus on speed, a specific speed requirement, might exclude some viable options for certain parts of New York, like fixed wireless and mobile. We'll see how it all pans out, but I think it's a great model that New York is following. With regard to state universal service funds, we've got, vast majority of states that have traditional U.S. service funds to support basic services. There's a typo there, I apologize for that. And only about 5 of those have USF that support broadband, and those states are California, Colorado, Delaware, Maine, and Nebraska. On the state policy side, we see a lot of states pursuing legislative and regulatory reforms that are focused on removing barriers to broadband. So states are looking at how to revisit rights-of-way issues, citing, franchising policies, and other policies to try and spur more infrastructure development. And we see legislatures trying to sort of incorporate broadband as a transformative technology throughout key sectors like education, energy, and healthcare. So we see lots of activity in this space, and in our opinion, the more activity we have, the better. In our view, there's a lot of opportunity for legislatures to actually revisit tax policies that might be unintentionally depressing broadband investment in rural areas. So, for example, wireless services are just really heavily taxed across this country, disproportionately so, and it seems like there's an opportunity there to somehow perhaps reduce the tax burden and spur and tie that to spur, investment in rural areas. And then there are, lots of tax policies that relate to equipment purchases and related infrastructure inputs that could be addressed. And one area that I would suggest is important for this committee and NCSL generally to consider is that there are opportunities for greater collaboration with municipalities. We're seeing a lot of examples across the country for some municipalities trying to go it alone in the broadband space, and that's a really, really risky endeavor. States clearly have some compelling interest in this arena, and there's an opportunity for states and municipalities to have a much more sort of collaborative exchange than perhaps they're having. When state leaders are looking at their state as a whole, there's opportunities to develop a comprehensive broadband strategic plan for the state, develop the state as a resource hub for broadband issues across the state, consider developing a broadband program office. There's lots that can be done at the state level to promote infrastructure. So in this area where there's just limited public dollars, anything that the states and municipalities can work on collaboratively is a good thing. So final slide here, just a number of takeaways that we suggest, and that's, there are significant, but they're pretty well-defined challenges to closing the remaining gaps in broadband availability in rural America. Focusing just on speed or just on a particular kind of technology really can limit the options available to the states. Broadband can come at different speeds and over different platforms, and states, I would suggest, need to be open to the best solution that might exist in a particular area of the state. Ultimately, public-private partnerships that are built around using these limited public dollars to leverage private expertise and investment would be the way to go, we would suggest. And, ultimately, demand-side issues have to be considered in this space. Our research has indicated that there is lower demand, it seems, even where broadband is available in some parts of rural America. So what can we do, across the country to try and address demand-side issues is important. And then finally, can't make this point strongly enough, state legislatures really have so much sort of ability and wherewithal to address many of the connectivity issues, but that's going to be best done, sort of playing upon point 3, when they bring other people to the table and have a comprehensive dialogue with stakeholders, with anchor institutions, with community leaders to figure out how these gaps need to be addressed. So with that, thank you very much, Ben, for having me here, and I very much look forward to the rest of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Charles. Really informative. We look forward to hearing your response to some of the questions I've been getting in. And as a reminder, you can type your question into the chat box in the lower left at any time, and we will hold them until the end of all the presentations. Now I'm pleased to have with us Keith Adams, Assistant Administrator for the United States Department of Agriculture's Rural Utility Service Telecoms Program. USDA's Rural Utility Service administers programs that provide infrastructure or infrastructure improvements to rural communities, including telecommunication services. Keith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben. I would like to thank you and Tricia for inviting me. I want to say good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar. Thank you to Charles for such an in-depth presentation. I really enjoyed that, and hopefully I can just add on to a little bit of what he talked about. I just want to give you a brief overview of the Rural Development Mission area. We're part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and our Rural Development Mission area provides loans and grants and guarantees in housing and small rural businesses, health care, first responder services. We do water and waste. We do electrical upgrades, energy efficiency, and, of course, our telecommunications program. As you can see here, the Rural Electrification Administration preceded the Rural Utility Service, which is an agency within the Rural Development Mission area, back in the 1930s. And in 1949, we received our approval to start giving telephone loans. And that was to really connect rural America. Just like the rural countryside was electrified, we wanted to get rural America connected via phones, and it started out with party lines, and it's evolved to where we are today. In 1995, all of our telephone loans and grants required everybody to be broadband capable. So, and we've moved from that, and since 2009, we have invested in this administration over $7 billion in our loan and grant program. Now, we have two main loan programs. Our first program is our traditional infrastructure program. This year we had a budget of $690 million, and these are loans to finance new and improved telecommunication infrastructure to communities 5,000 or less. And this would traditionally be your independent local exchange carriers. So in rural America, that would be rural telephone companies, rural telephone cooperatives who are in the community, who are serving the community. And again, these loans started out as telephone loans, but now they are providing voice, they are providing data, they are providing video. A lot of the companies, Charles talked about it earlier, receive subsidies from the Federal Communications Commission, and they use those to reach the hardest to reach places. Our loans complement that. Our other loan program is our Farm Bill loan program, and this year we had $20 million available for the finance cost of constructing broadband networks serving rural communities of 20,000 or more. So you can see here that's a little bit larger pool of residents than we have with our infrastructure program. And this program provides competition. So people can look to other areas that maybe are not in their service area, and they will present us a plan that they can show us that they're going to be profitable at the end of 5 years, they're going to sign up this many subscribers, they're going to serve this many homes. Of course, we would not give a Farm Bill broadband loan in an area where we already had a traditional infrastructure loan. As you can see here, so far this year, we've processed, last year we processed 17 loans for about $245 million. This year we're at 10 with several loans yet to process, 8 loans for $185 million. We've already approved 10 million, or 10 loans for $155 million. We published a notice of solicitation of applications last July, and we are in the process of finalizing and making recommendations on those. And we just opened another application window last Friday for the remaining $20 million of fiscal year 2016. We had $55 million for the 2015 program because of the Farm Bill in 2014 required some additional measurements and recommendations. We didn't have a program. We were getting through the regulation process. So we had essentially 2 years worth of funding there. And as you can see, we received 15 applications for well over $118 million. So you can see the program is almost doubly subscribed. Our two grant programs are our Community Connect grant program and our Distance Learning and Telemedicine program. And of course, when it comes to grants, the threshold for financial analysis is not as great because we're not asking for the money to be paid back. What we really look for in our grant programs is need. And our Community Connect grant program is one of our most popular programs because it gives grants to cover construction costs of broadband networks in communities 20,000 or less. But the communities have to be totally unserved, meaning that the broadband service here, you heard Charles talk about what FCC defines as unserved. In this case, with this program, it's 3 megabits down and 1 megabit up. So if you don't have that, we consider this area to be unserved, and applications that can prove that the areas are unserved are eligible under this particular program. We had $10.3 million for this program in FY 2016. The next program, grant program, is Distance Learning and Telemedicine. And we have $19 million in this program. And this program funds equipment. It can fund equipment for educational purposes. It can fund equipment for medical purposes. I've visited locations that have a main hospital in one location, maybe a larger city, and the critical care access unit is maybe 60 miles away. So somewhat isolated, but they do have broadband service, but they just don't have the funds or the means to get the equipment. Telestroke programs have actually saved people's lives in this program, and we're very glad to partner with a lot of the educational and medical facilities. Now, as you can see here, in 2015, for this particular program, Community Connect, we received 68 applications for over $100 million, and we were only able to approve 5 applications for $11 million. So you can see, again, that very oversubscribed, very popular program. And really, out of those 5 applications, 4 of those were in tribal trust areas. So we're very proud of the fact that we are serving tribal areas because we have seen, and Charles mentioned this earlier, that they do suffer from lack of access. Our Distance Learning and Telemedicine program, we received 191 applications in 2015. And for that should be 100 for $38 million, and we're approved 75 for $23 million there. And this year we just closed the window for the notice of solicitation of applications in mid-March, and we're now analyzing those grants, and hopefully we'll be able to announce those in the coming months. We talked a little bit about some of the special considerations that we have, and when the 2 grant programs are based on a point system. And they use we use the National School Lunch to look at poverty. We have matching fund requirements, but we do give additional points for projects that are serving tribal trust communities, and we started giving special emphasis points for our strike force and promise zones, which are USDA specific, but really are looking at persistent poverty over time, and we want to make sure that that's where we're focusing our efforts. And again, this is what we've done since 2009. You know, almost $3 billion in our infrastructure program, $339 million in the Farm Bill program, and we were really off for 2 years with that program. Our Community Connect, $77 million. This is learning and telemedicine, over $200 million. In our Broadband Initiatives program, which was part of the American Investment and Recovery Act, invested another $3.5 billion into the economy. Now, here are some this program, BIP as we call it, closed. The last funding was released on September 30th, 2015. But these are some of the accomplishments of this program. Now, this program was also kind of a comparison program to the Department of Commerce National Telecommunication Information Administration's BTOP program. But this program right here was going to households, and we delivered service to over 1.5 million households. We advanced over 95% of the funding. We had a small satellite award in there, and we responsibly returned some money to the Treasury, over $100 million back to the Treasury, because we managed projects and because our partners managed projects. I didn't mention this earlier, but when Charles mentioned something about public-private partnerships, that's what we do. We don't put up any towers. We don't put any fiber in the ground. We don't make any connections. That is all done by our partners, whether they are borrowers through our loan programs or grantees through our grant programs. We work with people on the ground in the communities, people who live in the community. As a matter of fact, we have about 26 general field representatives who live in the community and work with our borrowers and grantees on a regular basis. And we also leverage the fact that there's a rural development state office in all 50 states. Now, Charles also mentioned this too. The Broadband Opportunity Council was something that we were very honored to be a part of. President Obama executed a presidential memorandum on March 23rd and created the Broadband Opportunity Council, and he designated Secretary Vilsack from the Department of Agriculture and Secretary Pritzker for the Department of Commerce to be co-chairs. They delegated to Rural Development under Secretary Lisa Mensah and Assistant Secretary Larry Strickland of the National Telecommunications Information Administration. We worked very closely with 23 other executive branch agencies. The Federal Communication Commission was not a member, but they were in all of the meetings with us, and we provided a report to the president, which I would encourage everybody to take a look at, because with this process, what we did with this process was we actually went out and looked at the current available resources from the General Service Administration, from the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Department, from the Institute for Museum and Library Sciences, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Interior, the Department of Education, the Department of Transportation, so many federal agencies that contributed to broadband. And, of course, everyone doesn't have a rural focus like we do, but we were able to find areas where people were trying to serve the neediest and the most underserved populations, which many times will be rural America. So we came up in USDA with 3 or 4 recommendations that we're going to be working on over the next year. One was the Community Facilities Guaranteed Loan Program. You've heard talk about municipalities earlier. President Obama made a speech last year from Cedar Falls, Iowa, who developed their own municipal broadband network. As Charles mentioned, sometimes it's a little bit harder to do when you go it alone, but we're looking at our Community Facilities group who has funding that could pick up where we leave off, because they can service communities more than 5,000, more than 20,000. And, they build hospitals, they build mental health institutions, they build libraries, they build other things, and they will be able to work with people who had an interest in that. The Rural Business Cooperative Service and Business and Industry Loan Program, we think that that's going to be something where people can use that money for consulting services, for feasibility studies. That money's out there. We want to make sure that the small rural telephone companies, the small rural cooperative services, if they don't have the cash right then, that they can maybe explore some of those programs. Then we talk about the Rural Utility Service. That's our sister group. The electric program has a smart grid program that has money that can't take the dark fiber all the way to the home, but they can take it maybe 60 or 70% of the way. And a lot of electric cooperatives are providing broadband services, because a lot of the energy efficiency equipment that they're using to heat homes and cool homes need broadband, not to mention mobile broadband for agricultural farming. But in this case, they have smart grid program opportunities. And lastly, the telecommunications program, our program, is looking at our regulation, because our regulation is very old. It doesn't even talk about broadband. It talks about telephone. And we want to take a look to see what we can do to modernize and maybe open up some opportunities within our program. So we'll be looking at that. As you know, changing the government regulation and sometimes changing the statute is not an easy thing to do, and maybe time-consuming, but we feel it's well worth the investment. So with that, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity again, and I'll wait to see if I can answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith. And actually, the first question in a second is coming your way, so don't go too far. But with that, I would like to shift gears to the final portion of today's webinar for our question and answer session. And just as a reminder, the chat box is in the lower left-hand portion of your screen, so if you do have a question, please type it in there. But Keith, just a quick question to follow up on your presentation. You obviously, you mentioned a wide number of programs and opportunities. I get, the question, and I'm going to try and summarize it, is, what is maybe the best way to kind of, access some of those programs that have funding? Is it, to go to USD, a specific website on USDA? But, because you talked about a number of them, just kind of in general, best ways to kind of start the process of potentially accessing some of those grants or financing funds?
Well, thank you for the question. The best way to probably start your search is to search USDA.rd.gov. That's USDA.rd.gov. And then you'll come to the Rural Development homepage, and you'll see a listing for programs. And then you just have to come down to telecommunications programs, and you'll find all the programs that I talked about. You'll find a fact sheet. You'll also find an application guide for some. And also you'll find field contacts for the people that we talked about in our general field representative. So if you're in Iowa, you can contact Tom Jensen. Or if you're in eastern Washington or eastern Idaho, you can contact Joe Bradley. So we have 25 men and women around the country who can actually help you. They can help more with the grant, with the loans than they can the grant. They can hold your hand through the grant process, through the loan process, but the grant process is competitive. So there's certain things that they can and can't do there. If you also go to USDA.gov and you look at topics, they have a topic for broadband. So you can go right to the broadband off of the topics, and you'll get to our website. So that would be the first thing that I would advise someone who's just starting out, is to take a look at our programs and talk to some people. We're more than willing to talk to anybody who thinks that they want to expand broadband to rural America, because that's what we do every morning when we get up. Is we're looking to see who we can help, who we can assist to provide enhanced broadband to places that just don't have it.
Great, thank you. Charles, next question for you. From the state, city, county perspective, do the economics favor owning a broadband system used by, schools, hospitals, libraries, or other emergency services, given the potential implications of competition?
So that's a great question, and I think a lot of folks are thinking about that question, pondering the issue. So I'm glad it came up here. The history of government ownership of these types of systems is not that great overall. There's been lots of underuse of the systems, and you've got examples out there of systems that are not, as responsive as folks might want them to be. So, for example, average speeds in schools are low, in many areas. So I don't know that government systems are a silver bullet of any type. That said, there are avenues to pursue. I think following up upon Keith's question and answer just a minute ago, that could help. So there are E-rate reforms underway that may help enhance connectivity in schools and get speeds up. And historically, there's been a rural preference in funding allocations for E-rate dollars, which are dollars from the Universal Service Fund program that go to schools. So that's another sort of strategy for community leaders to be thinking about. There's also a rural telemedicine program via the Universal Service Fund, which might, serve as a nice complement to the programs Keith talked about. So that's rural telemedicine via Universal Service Fund. Regarding emergency services, FirstNet, and I'm assuming some folks have heard about that, but FirstNet is in the process of being built, and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration is coordinating that. Congress, within that program, has created and allocated some spectrum to support the program, and there's ongoing coordination with state and local counterparts. So, I appreciate the point that, folks in rural areas are hoping to have some type of more competition that helps keep, prices reasonable. I just don't know that government networks are at all the solution. They haven't proven to be where they sort of come together. So this gets back to having a broader conversation with private sector participants, with state leaders, to try and figure out a strategy to get, I think what the question is getting at, an aggregation of utilization, so to speak, so that the network, in fact, makes economic sense. The reality is, I think funding will need to come in from some of these other federal sources, from state sources, to help that process along.
Great. This next question is kind of for both of you. Really kind of, I guess, getting at the development or increased usage of smartphones across the country, and how has that kind of changed the rural broadband conversation? Has it increased decreased usage, increased or decreased the need? So I didn't know if either of you had thoughts on that.
Well, this is Keith. We're technology neutral in the rural utility service, so we consider wireless solutions just as well as dark fiber going to the home. So I don't know if it has impacted, made things less of a need. We just know that there's some limitations when it comes to mobile solutions, and sometimes when people when they rely on that, they may miss opportunities for the dark fiber, which is really going to be a place where you're going to get your fastest speeds and your reliability.
This is Charles. So that's a really great question as well, and I think when you look at the data points, about the same percentage of rural Americans rely on smartphones to access the internet as do urbanites, and that's about 15% of rural Americans rely on smartphones to access the internet. We see consumer demand is telling us mobile, 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 smartphone, 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 and that really is very visible in younger generations. With millennials, I read an article today about AMC theaters thinking about allowing texting in movie theaters, and one of the sort of comments in the article was like telling a young person to turn off their phone in a movie theater is like telling them to cut off their left arm. So we see really a lot of consumer preference for wireless, and that feeds into a lot of issues. It feeds into allowing companies to figure out ways to deliver more and robust mobile services. So getting to this issue, I think there's a lot of potential for wireless broadband in rural America. It might not be the solution to everything, end all, be all, in all instances, but there's definitely potential there. And mobile broadband is widely available, more so in many areas than wired broadband. So I think we need to start thinking of it as a competitor to wired broadband, at least for some folks. And again, a lot of people would say that I prefer wireless, that's how I want to connect, I don't really care about a wired connection. Not everyone, but some. And so all of that matters when it comes to supporting even more deployment of wireless to rural areas. So the lesson here, I think, is that we don't get tied up just in talking about wired broadband, wireline, fiber. We need to be talking, about wireless. When 98.2% of the population in this country has access to mobile broadband, to a connection of at least 10 megabits per second down, how do we continue that dynamic? And sort of all the programs that we've talked about and all the opportunities, there's a wireless component there. And for communities, that then leads to I think, a discussion of how do we get more wireless infrastructure here? What do we need? Can we expedite tower siting? What can we do to facilitate build-out of wireless infrastructure if wired infrastructure may be especially challenging?
Great, thank you. And Charles, this last question for you. One of the attendees, commenting on your presentation, your statement specifically that, addressing demand side issues and really just kind of what that would look like more broadly. Still with us, Charles?
Sorry about that. I was instructed to put my phone on mute when not talking, and it was still on, so I'm off mute now.
No worries.
So that's a great question. So much of the conversation here always talks about supply side issues. On the demand side, a lot of our research to date has been focused on broadband adoption. And when you look at key demographics and sectors, senior citizens, people with disability, communities of color, rural communities, the healthcare arena, the energy arena, there are so many sort of barriers to more robust adoption and use, even when the infrastructure is there. So, we would suggest that it's really important to determine what the adoption landscape is in a community, in an area, and try and pinpoint under-adopting communities or underutilizing communities so that specific outreach and training programs can be developed to meet those needs. So are there digital entrepreneurship programs that are needed? Are there programs, for seniors that are needed? Are there programs that are needed to try and buttress the educational system in an area to make better use of broadband? So it's a very granular and nuanced type of analysis that has to occur. It's not an easy sort of quick answer, here's what we do. It's trying to assess the landscape. And states, groups like NCSL, state legislatures can really serve as a hub for facilitating solutions in rural areas, helping match expert organizations with cities and municipalities, communities that need help, and actually providing some assistance. Relative to how much is spent on supply side issues, a little money on demand side issues can go a very long way in helping to develop programs that are, equipping people. And I would suggest that this demand side component is critically important for so many states as we hear more and more about the job losses that the country is going to face with automation in the sector, as we see sort of our whole economy shifting to an information-based economy. There's a whole new set of sort of training and education requirements that are going to have to sort of be pursued by states so that the citizenry across the country is really equipped to use this technology, to use broadband, to use their smartphones, to use their computers or tablets for more than just viewing a Netflix movie. This technology is becoming part and parcel of a person's ability to exist and bring in income for their families in many instances. So training and helping people figure out how to utilize broadband in a manner that supports them and helps them reach their goals in life is really, really important. You can have all the infrastructure in the world, but if an under-adopting community is not really using broadband, you've got to figure out how to address that.
Great, thank you. Not seeing any more questions, I would like to extend a final thank you. Charles and Keith, thank you so much for joining us today. And of course, thanks to all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar will be made available shortly, and you can actually download today's slides, again, by clicking on the library icon in the upper right-hand corner, which is the yellow and blue icon just to the right of the microphone. Our next webinar will be 2 weeks from today, focusing on multi-sector public-private partnerships, not just transportation. To register or find out more information about that webinar or the 2016 Spring Webinar Series, please visit ncsl.org, or of course you can send me a quick email. Thank you again for your continued interest and support of NCSL, and have a great day and a great weekend.